Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to have you join us for this very special event. Some of you are on Zoom, some of you are on Facebook Live or YouTube, but whatever platform you're on, you're in for a real treat. Today we have a wonderful discussion based on a path-breaking new report that was issued by the Washington Institute by two of our scholars, Mike Eisenstadt and David Pollock. The latest in our Transition 2021 series. This is a series of almost a dozen reports that we've been issuing ever since Inauguration Day that look at discrete issues on the Middle East policy agenda for the new administration. Some are big picture questions, some are narrow, specific, country-specific issues. This one is one of our most forward-looking reports. It is more than just an expansion of a report that Dave Pollock and Mike Eisenstadt did several years ago that looked at the broad array of hard and soft aspects of the U.S. Israel relationship. It is an agenda-setting report that looks far into the future for how the Biden administration could invest in expanding the benefits that America derives from its important partnership with the state of Israel on a broad array of topics. A very detailed report. We're not even going to be able to get into all the different areas of potential and actual cooperation between the United States and Israel in today's session. Today, we're going to be whetting your appetite with some specific focused discussion on critical aspects of this partnership and areas where we and the Israelis can work together, not just for their benefit, but especially to advance U.S. national interests in the Middle East. I'm delighted to have not just my colleagues, Dave Pollock and Mike Eisenstadt, participating today, but we've asked two specialists to join, specialists with specific knowledge on critical aspects of the participation of the partnership that are focused in this report. The report is called Asset Test 2021, How the United States Can Keep Benefiting from Its Alliance with Israel. And joining us today are Lieutenant General Henry Trey Obering III, retired from the U.S. Air Force with more than 35 years experience in space and defense systems, development and operations, serving, among other things, as director of the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency. Delighted to have General Obering with us for today's event. And then also joining us is my friend Samantha Ravich. Samantha is director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She has served on the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence Working Group. General Obering is going to focus on missile defense. Samantha is going to focus on AI. But to open our discussion, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Mike Eisenstadt, our Kahn Fellow and Director of the Institute's Military Security Program. And then to close our discussion, after General Obering and Samantha Ravich, I'm going to turn to our Bernstein Fellow, David Pollock. They are a dynamic duo who have produced an outstanding report, the full text of which you can find on the website of the Washington Institute. So before I begin, just one more housekeeping word, which is if you would like to get into the conversation that we will have after our brief presentations by our panelists, please feel free to email me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. That's rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org, or you can use the Q&A function on the Zoom, on the bottom of the Zoom bar, if you're joining us on that platform. So with that, I'm going to turn our virtual podium over to my colleague, Mike Eisenstadt. Mike?
Thanks, Rob. And I just want to say it's an honor here to be again appearing with my partner in crime, David Pollock, co-author of this piece, as well as General Obering and Dr. Ravich. I look forward to hearing your comments afterwards. I just want to also say that in addition to thanking Dave for his partnership and collegiality in co-authoring this piece, I want to thank our research assistants, Henry Mim and Corona Austin, for their invaluable assistance, and my brother-in-law, Paul, who's been sending me for about a decade now articles on these kind of topics. I think he knew before I did that I'd be writing with Dave a second version of this paper. So anyhow, Corey, could you please put up the slides, please? Okay, this is the cover of the report. If you want to know what it looks like when you download it, next page. Okay, basically the U.S. Israel relationship is often described in terms of shared values, democratic politics, common strategic interests, but it really doesn't get at the nub of the matter. It's really much more complex than that. In fact, it's evolved and become much more complex than that in recent years. First of all, if you look at the global security environment, the thing we keep hearing about is great, we're in an era of great power competition once again, and great power competition is defined not just in political and military terms, but increasingly also in economic and technological terms, the ability of the United States to compete mainly against China. So the first thing I would say is that I think Israel, for reasons we'll explain in a moment, is very well placed to deliver outsized contributions in this economic technological competition that the United States is waging. And the China's factor is probably something we'll be discussing a little bit later, how that fits in. Likewise, Israel is also often described as a stable democracy. I think you could say that it's the American ally in the Middle East whose interests most closely align with those of the US. If you look at, in terms of Israel's interest in regional stability, the close cooperation that Israel does with Egypt and Jordan in order to ensure the security of those regimes, to the point of conducting airstrikes in Sinai against groups like Islamic State there. Also, close security cooperation with many of the Gulf Arab states that precedes the recent normalization agreements or the Abraham Accords with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the like. This also fits in with Israeli efforts to counter violent extremism. I mentioned the airstrikes against ISIS in Sinai, but also efforts to limit Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza. Likewise, Israeli efforts to contain Israeli influence serve American interests. This includes Israel's gray zone campaign in Syria against Iran's efforts to create a foothold there and use it as a springboard for projecting influence in the Levant, as well as Israeli sabotage operations against Iran's nuclear program. And we could discuss that perhaps more during the discussion or Q&A. As the United States reduces its military and intelligence presence in the region as part of its efforts to rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region and to focus on the challenge of China and resurgent Russia, Israel and its partnership with some of its newfound Arab friends is going to be increasingly important in order for the United States to secure its interests in the region. Israel is also a vital partner in helping confront regional and global sustainability and climate resilience challenges. A little bit more about that in a moment. And finally, a valuable, unique contributor to the dynamism of important sectors of the US economy. I have this evergreen quote by Bill Gates made in 2006. The innovation going on in Israel is critical to the future of the technology business, which I think, again, is just as valid today as it was when he said it then. I used to think that Israel's contribution was in niche sectors, for instance, IT and the like. But I've come to think that, if you're enabling e-commerce or e-learning, we're actually enabling almost every sector of the economy. So there's actually multiplier effects for what Israel does in its partnerships in whether it be in the AI or IT sector or sustainability sectors. So the bottom line we're trying to say is that although, of course, it's an asymmetric relationship between the United States and Israel, the US is a great power that has provided critical assistance to Israel to ensure its survival and thriving. It is a two-way relationship that delivers tangible benefits to the US. Next page, please. So here's a few examples of, what we define as Israel's contribution to hard and soft security challenges that the United States faces. First of all, in the soft security arena, I mentioned economic competitiveness a little bit more on the next page. We'll get to that in a moment. AI, IT, cyber. AI, and I think Samantha is going to be talking about this, AI has the potential to transform everything we do. And to the degree that Israel contributes to America's AI success, it'll play a very important role. Israel in the field of water and food security. Israel has become from a water scarce country to a water self-sufficient country. And Israeli lessons in this regard will be very important in the future as we focus increasingly on dealing with the impacts of climate change and the like. Alternative and renewable energy sources. Israel is a world leader in the solar arena. Medical R&D, public health. We've seen how Israeli efforts to battle COVID, although it was an uneven effort, really provided very useful and valuable insights for the United States efforts in dealing with this problem. Likewise, with regard to traditional or hard security threats, intelligence sharing, this has been going on since the 1950s. It's going to become even more important as the U.S. reduces its presence in the region and cuts down on its ability to focus on what's going on in the Middle East. Counterterrorism cooperation has been going on for decades. Most recently, the apparent Israeli killing of the Al-Qaeda #2 in Tehran in August of 2020. Drone, rocket, and missile defense. General Obering will be talking about that. But I'll just mention that Israel right now has about half a dozen counter-drone systems that are being evaluated by the US government. Some of them have been deployed and tested. Military lessons learned. The United States has a lot to learn, and I've written about this with regard to Israeli gray zone activities against Iran and Syria, as I hope we will adopt more of a gray zone posture vis-a-vis our adversaries for domestic political reasons and the like. Defense industrial cooperation. There's a lot that already has been done. We have a photo later on of the joint helmet mounted queuing system that almost every American aircraft and American pilot wears. It's made by Collins and Elbit of America. It was originally invented in Israel, but is now produced here. Good example of industrial cooperation that has mutual benefits. So the bottom line here is that many allies contribute to US security in one or more of these areas that I discussed, but few contribute in so many diverse and important ways as Israel. Next page, please. And this is the last page I'm going to be, with information I'll be discussing about Israel's contributions. If you look at trade data, Israel is only about 2.5% of the population of the Middle East, but it accounts for about 20% of US exports to the region in 2020. Okay, and that's the way it's been the last few years. Only the UAE and Saudi Arabia import more than Israel does. And if you compare to Turkey, which is not included in these figures, I just included Turkey because it's a large country that has 9 times the population of Israel. Israel still imports just a little bit more from the US than does Turkey. Again, Turkey has 9 times the population. If you look at Israel's, these various indices, number 1 in engineers and scientists per capita in the world, number 1 in R&D investment as a percentage of GNP in the world, number 1 in terms of AI firms per capita, and number 3 in total AI startups, total number of AI startups in the world. Wastewater recycling, number 1, number 5 in patents per capita, number 7 in innovation. So, okay, this is nice for Israel. What does it mean for the US? I'll tell you. Basically, you have more than 300 US companies that have established research and development centers in Israel to benefit from Israel's innovation ecosystem. And this enables American companies to preserve their competitive edge. Also, many of the Israeli companies have moved to the United States and become American companies in order to scale up and reach a global market. So this is, I think, really the bottom line is Israel's success in being an innovator, in being a leader in many of the areas that are going to be essential to dealing with the hard and soft security challenges of the future, also benefit the United States. And as I mentioned before here, the last line here, US companies are generally, because of the close relationship between the United States and Israel and the close ties, the educational system, the political system, and strategic cooperation, US companies are often partners of choice for Israeli firms that want to go global. They come here first. I'll close with a graphic on the next page. This is the last slide. Just show you, this is from a European publication put out by a consulting firm on the race for AI leadership. Israel is, if you look here, US is number 1, China number 2. Close behind is Israel's number 3 as the main hotspot in the world for AI startups. Anyhow, that's my last point. I look forward to hearing what General Obering and Dr. Ravich have to say, and my partner Dave. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. I just want to underscore the key sentence in your penultimate paragraph about Israel's success being America's success, which in these hard and soft security issues that you identified. And so with that, I'm going to turn to General Obering to focus on a specific aspect of Israel's innovation in terms of missile defense. And again, just to remind you, if you want to get into the conversation later, please feel free to contact me either using the Q&A function on Zoom or email at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. General Obering, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert, and I'm very pleased to be invited to participate in this panel. I feel very strongly about these topics, and especially about the collaboration and cooperation between the United States and Israel. Surprisingly enough, my 35-year career in the Air Force was bookended by cooperation with the Israelis. My very first collaboration with Israel came when I was flying as an operational F-4E pilot back in the 70s. And the Yom Kippur War had provided several very important lessons learned. And Israel sent an aircrew team to debrief us on their tactics and results. And I'll never forget sitting in the briefing on one of the first air engagements of the war, which was involving 2 Israeli Phantoms versus 28 of the Egyptian MiG-17s and MiG-21s. And in the aerial combat that ensued, the Phantom pair managed to down 7 to 8 Egyptian planes and drive off the rest. Needless to say, we were mesmerized by the gun camera film that they brought as part of their presentations, and we were able to apply those lessons into our tactics, techniques, and procedures. From that moment on, I paid attention when the Israelis had something to say, frankly. And then at the end of my career, when I was the director of the Missile Defense Agency, Ariel Herzog, who was the director of the Israeli Missile Defense Organization, and I spent an awful lot of time on how we could collaborate to both innovate and develop and accelerate missile defense capability for both the U.S. as well as Israel. The U.S., of course, was concerned about missiles fired primarily from North Korea and Iran at that time. Israel was facing not only the potential for missile attacks from Iran, but also the shorter range missiles from terrorist units in Lebanon and the rocket attacks from Gaza. I remember visiting the city of Sderot there in the south and seeing the expended rockets from Gaza and being briefed on how they were targeting schools when the students were going to and from class. And of course, they had taught the students how to run to a red room during the attack. This, of course, was before the Iron Dome system had been developed. And at that time, the U.S. was just beginning to deploy the new Patriot PAC-3 batteries, the ship-based SM-3s for Aegis, and our long-range ground-based mid-course interceptors. We had also more than 10 programs in development, including the THAAD, the Sea-based X-band radar, kinetic energy interceptor, and many others. Israel had fielded the Arrow 2 interceptor and the Green Pine radar and was working with us on Arrow 3 and the Super Green Pine radar. The U.S. had also deployed PAC-3s to Israel, and I actually had coordinated with the EUCOM commander at the time to station a permanent presence of a U.S. TPY-2 radar after one of our Juniper Cobra exercises in Israel. I've always been impressed with the high quality of the Israeli technology. I very clearly remember in one discussion with Arya, I had proposed a series of knowledge points. These were milestones in the development of any program, which you had to actually demonstrate that you had a handle on the technology, whether you did a static firing or whether you executed code or whatever, but it was not just a review. And I had laid those out. He had asked me my advice. I had laid them out for the Arrow 3 program. And frankly, when I laid them out, I didn't know if they would be able to achieve them. And they, of course, achieved every one of those. So where do we go from here in terms of U.S. Israeli missile defense program? Historically, a percentage of the Missile Defense Agency budget each year supports architectural studies, co-development, co-production, cooperative testing, and operational feedback for modernization with Israel. Going forward, I believe that there should be very strong collaboration in the areas of short-range missile and rocket defense, upgrades to existing systems, and development of their next-generation capability, and specifically exploitation of new environments such as space. Now, the Missile Defense Agency in the U.S. today continues to support all layers of the Israeli Missile Defense Organization developed systems, the sensors, the command and control, the battle management, the Arrow, the David Sling, and the Iron Dome programs. Recently, the U.S. Army purchased 2 Iron Dome batteries as an interim option and is evaluating their long-term options for that capability. And a focus that is clearly coming up this year is what is the next generation Arrow interceptor going to look like? I also foresee that space will play a much bigger role in missile defense in the future, and that includes threats from Iran, North Korea, et cetera. In the U.S., of course, our space tracking and surveillance system remains on orbit, supporting the warfighters, and continues to serve as a prototype and a demo for the hypersonic and ballistic tracking surveillance system, space surveillance system that is now has completed the ground characterization, phenomenology experiments, and is now focused on deploying the first 2 satellites in fiscal year 23 for continued experimentation and incorporation into real-world tracking and the flight test support. MDA remains closely aligned to the Space Development Agency and the United States Space Force and their planned architectures, and the kill assessment that's being deployed and is undergoing operationalization into the homeland and regional architectures is another area that I think is ripe for collaboration and cooperation. All of the ground and sea-based sensors have completed the first phase of upgrades and testing to support a new space domain awareness mission for tasking versus via the command and control battle management communication system. And I think that with the increased competition from China, a resurgent Russia, and increasingly lethal missile capabilities that are coming from Iran and North Korea, I see an emerging missile defense architecture in space for the future. This would not only include space-based sensors, but also kill capabilities, such as smart integrated nanosat constellations and directed energy weapons, such as high-energy lasers. And across the board in these areas, there could be collaboration between the 2 countries. This architecture could be based on technologies that today are being developed in the commercial world, such as launch capabilities and satellite technologies that are coming from commercial companies such as SpaceX, artificial intelligence, peer-to-peer communication networks that are coming out of companies like Uber and Google Maps. Again, this arena could present potential cooperation between the United States and Israel and some of the ways to offset cost in some of these research and development activities. As we move into the future, and I know that Mike and David alluded to this in their paper, I think with the growing Iranian threat and building on the recent Abraham Accords, I would hope that we could start thinking more about regional missile defense architectures in this very important region. In closing, I want to emphasize one very important point. The successful collaboration and cooperation of the U.S. and Israel has been based on shared values, common threats, and trust. But we're entering a very dangerous time, I believe, for both nations in terms of the threats. And since World War II, U.S. military capabilities have been critically reliant on superior technological advantage. And we're beginning to see that advantage seriously challenged by countries, especially China. I think we must be vigilant to these threats that present themselves across the spectrum, from gray zone activities to hypersonic weapons to space and cyber capabilities. And we need to collaborate with allies like Israel, especially allies that have the technological capabilities that the Israelis have, in order to meet these emerging future threats. So I wanted to keep my remarks brief this afternoon so that we would have time for questions, and I look forward to those. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, General. It's really fascinating. I appreciate it. And so now we're going to transition from this missile defense discussion to a discussion of AI. And I'm going to turn to my colleague, Dr. Samantha Ravich. Samantha, the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you, Rob. And actually, it's not as much of a transition as I'm sure the general would say, as a continuation. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. And I think the report by the Washington Institute is an important one, and it is very timely. It really has become an urgent matter that countries around the world that uphold democratic principles and fair and open markets truly start working together to protect themselves from authoritarian and predatory nations. So I kind of want to discuss, in the realm of AI and ML, machine learning, tech burden sharing, but I actually like, I think a better phrase for it is tech advantage sharing. And mutual defense in technology as opposed to burden sharing. So as I said, I'm going to focus my comments a bit on AI ML, but some other technologies as well. But I think AI and ML is the technology, of course, that's going to drive our future prosperity, our health, our security. And as Mike said in the opening, Israel ranks first globally in AI companies per capita. I think it was 3 in startups. So in this field, there really is a great opportunity to advantage share. Not burden share, advantage share. All right, so where would we want to place our priorities to cooperate in AI ML? And I think a good way to start is to prioritize where there are the most significant challenges. The recent congressionally mandated National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence called out the need for the Department of Defense, the need in the Department of Defense for a common digital infrastructure, and the need for organizational reforms to successfully define a joint warfighting network architecture. Right, so we of course need to think about this. What does this mean for our own Department of Defense? But we really also have to start thinking about what it means globally, because there are tremendous threats out there in this space in AI ML. In 2017, China released its strategy on how it would dominate global AI by 2030. And Putin, of course, never to be overtaken by anybody else, said in his own statement that whomever becomes the leader in this field will rule the world, quote, rule the world. So that's why I was actually heartened with the creation of the Partnership for Defense, started by DoD's Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, JAIC, last September. So JAIC is a relatively small, unfortunately, I think way too small, office within the Department of Defense, has a budget of about $270 million, which of course sounds kind of maybe big to some of our smaller global partners out there, but when you have an $800 billion budget and you're spending $270 million on artificial intelligence, which your adversary just said, whoever rules it rules the world, you have to wonder whether we're putting enough money into these things. Anyway, JAIC integrates tech development on AI with processes and policies so that the department can actually achieve long-term AI success and scalability. The Partnership for Defense is laying the groundwork for future AI-enabled joint warfare capabilities so that allies can truly fight in a joint manner. Right now, the partnership includes Australia, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Japan, Norway, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, the UK, and Israel, right? So right from the get-go, one of the original founding members of this new Partnership for Defense on AI includes Israel, which is a fantastic thing. Now, there's a lot to do to make joint warfighting capability a reality, and we're far from that in the AI space. I'd say we're in the crawl stage right now. We're understanding our own data needs, where that data is, how it is stored, how it is used. And on that topic, so as Rob mentioned, I'm a member of the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board, and on that board, I co-chaired the AI Working Group alongside of Tom Rosenbaum, who's president of Caltech. And we found that, at least in DOE and the 17 national labs, there was no system in place capture, analyze, share AI, ML data models, algorithms, and results and lessons learned. Right now, everyone is needing to become an AI expert just to do their basic research and scientific tasks. And it makes absolutely no sense, right? So chemists should be allowed to do basic chemistry research without having to become AI experts in order to do their chemistry research. So we looked at, could we have an AI expert corps that could be lent out to various labs and within the DOE complex to help with the actual AI creation, working with subject matter experts. So think about how that could work if we aligned efforts more broadly with a country like Israel and advantage shared our tech talent in this space. We also highlighted the lack of focus on cybersecurity within AI. Cybersecurity for data and for algorithms themselves. I mean, the whole notion of AI is you're gathering huge, tremendous, large amounts of data and you're putting it all in one place, which is ripe for adversarial attack because data is the oil of the 21st century. Likewise, the cybersecurity of the algorithms itself need to be protected, or we are literally creating artificial intelligence capabilities for the adversary to use against us with our own data. And this has kind of been the, whatever the phrase is, the ugly stepchild of artificial intelligence. People don't want to focus on the cybersecurity aspects of it. Again, working in cooperation with a country like Israel to protect our data, protect our algorithms makes a lot of sense. So all of these things, as I said, could be burden shared or advantage shared with a close ally such as Israel. But this all resides on, of course, another piece of this is the supply chain of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Where do we get the data? What about the semiconductors to run the compute power, cloud storage? I was really heartened that Israel has recently, I guess, created a CFIUS, a review process, foreign investment. But from what I understand, it's a bit of an empty suit at the moment. It doesn't include technology, it's voluntary, it's not statutory. And I get that the Israelis don't really want to regulate technology, that it could stifle innovation. But I would say, you know what else stifles innovation? Having your intellectual property stolen by an adversary and used against you. I think that kind of stifles innovation. So, look, it really, and I have to underscore this, because it is brought out in the report, and I think the general said it and Rob said it. Look, my concern on Israel and China is that Israel might not yet get the true China threat, right? They see it is an authoritarian nation, wanting, willing, able to subvert democratic countries and free markets. So Israel is starting to agree more on this, where they are agreeing to do things. But I worry it's because we, with the United States, their closest ally, their indispensable ally, is asking them to do things. They need to get to the point where they're seeing the threat the way we're seeing it. The way the Brits are seeing it, the way the Aussies are seeing it, not just because we're asking them to see it in that way. For instance, I'm particularly concerned about the lack of attention to the China threat in Israeli universities. The FBI has begun to really brief up our universities. DOJ is bringing indictments. So all of these things are absolutely critical as we go forward in forging this type of technological relationship, again, on AI ML, but way beyond that as well. So quickly, I just want to say three other very quick points on other areas of technological cooperation that I think are just ripe to move ahead if the right care is taken over it. Certainly one is on medical devices, medical device cybersecurity. Again, gets to everything I just said. We're taking this more seriously. The FDA just hired its first ever medical device cybersecurity director, Kevin Fu, great guy. Another area that I think is truly has tons of running room and is absolutely critical is on water security. Operational technology in water security. There's been a lot of focus on energy security. I'm a commissioner on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, focused a lot on that. We have turned our attention to water security because you can live without lights for a few days, but try living without water. and the amount of attacks that are ramping up on water security, whether it was Kansas a couple of years ago, Oldsmar in Florida. Of course, the Israelis understand about what attacks on water look like, given what the Iranians tried to do. But the Israeli companies are focused on this, and they're quite good on new types of operational technology, and price competitive. Let me just add that. And this is something, so just another data point, because I'll have data points. There are 3,000 bulk power producers in the United States. There are 3,000 water utilities in California alone. There are 70,000 water utilities across the United States, most of them small. They're going to need new operational technology, cyber secure operational technology, to protect our water supplies. And so partnering, advantage sharing with a country like Israel makes a ton of sense. So I want to wrap up and, of course, answer whatever we can during Q&A. But I just want to say, in AI, ML, and in technology beyond that, Israel really is a superpower. And I would suggest that it is no different. They are no different now as a superpower in the world on these issues than the first 5 members of the UN Security Council were in their day as being nuclear weapon states. So with that, I will turn it back over. Thanks.
Fantastic. Actually, that's a really interesting comparison that you just made there, Samantha. Have to think about that. Fascinating. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to turn for some concluding remarks in our opening set of presentations to Dave Pollock. And then just once again, if you have questions, I've received a bunch of them already. Please email me directly, rsatloff, WashingtonInstitute.org, or use the Q&A function. Dave, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be with you, Rob, and our distinguished panelists, and to present a little bit more about this report and about the subject for today, U.S.-Israeli partnerships. What I would like to do very, very briefly is to pick up the thread where Samantha just left it off, talk a little bit about Israeli partnerships with the United States in areas of medical and environmental technologies, where I think Israel has an outsized contribution to make to American companies, to the American economy, and in fact, beyond that, as I'll talk in just a moment, even to the world as a whole, in partnership with the United States. So just briefly about the medical aspect of things and the public health aspect of things. Obviously, all of us have had our attention captured in the last year or so by the coronavirus. And Israel, as Mike mentioned at the beginning, early on had an uneven record in dealing with this crisis, but has turned out to be a global leader in procuring, administering, tracking, and analyzing big data from coronavirus vaccines. One witty person put it that Israel has moved from being startup nation, as we used to say a decade ago, to vaccine nation today. And this is in partnership with American companies, with American public health professionals and scientific experts. And a good example of that, of course, is the deal that Israel struck with the Pfizer Corporation and with its CEO personally, Albert Bourla, who's a great champion of partnership with Israel in the medical field, in order to provide vaccines to the Israeli population in exchange for the data, the full set of medical data from that population that Pfizer and other American companies and global public health authorities and organizations can use in order to improve the efficacy of the vaccines, the effectiveness of the public health campaigns, and to track this far into the future. This is just one very current, very important example of close American-Israeli partnerships that involve governments, private sector companies, technical experts, artificial intelligence, and big data applied to practical solutions to today's most urgent public health and medical problems. Israel is a world leader and is happy to partner with the United States to our mutual benefit and to extend those benefits to other countries around the world. I want to mention just one other example from the medical and public health field that caught my attention on a very personal level in the last few years. It so happens that I was invited to an event in Washington, D.C. that was sponsored by an Israeli medical training program in cooperation with American partners called Near School of the Heart. It was founded by an Israeli husband and wife medical duo who invented, patented, and distributed one of the most commonly used heart stents all over the world and made a fortune out of it, and turned around and decided to donate much of that fortune to medical education for young Israeli, American, and Arab high school and undergraduate students. Take these kids from all around the region and from the United States and give them professional training and internships in order to encourage them to pursue an advanced medical career. Thousands have been trained at this school, and I was personally honored and moved to be part of an event in DC just a couple of years ago, at which the founders of this medical organization, in partnership with their American counterparts, celebrated this success in the public presence of former President Bill Clinton and former President George W. Bush. It was just a small personal example of the way in which and the level at which Israeli public health and medical partnerships with the United States have achieved such great success in the recent past and promise to do so in the near future. Let me speak very briefly about environmental issues. Samantha mentioned water security. It's one area in which Israel is a world leader in managing every aspect of water security, not just the cyber aspects of it, but wastewater treatment and research, drip irrigation and other methods of water conservation, and the application of artificial intelligence to advanced agricultural technologies that enable the world, not just Israel and the United States, in desert regions or other water scarce areas, especially now beset by climate change, to manage water in the most efficient way for public use, for food production, for sanitary purposes, for every aspect of the entire human water cycle. And the United States benefits greatly in its own economy, in its own technologies, in its own corporate enterprises and technological advancements from partnership with Israel in that area. And that's just one, and I'm going to show you a photograph of one of these devices in a moment. That's just one of many environmental areas, from water and food security to alternate energy resources to climate resilience technologies exported all over the world, in which Israeli and American partnerships are thriving today and promise to thrive even more in the future. But, and let me see, please, Corey, the first slide, please. The report acknowledges that Israel faces challenges in maintaining this record and in sustaining this partnership with the United States at the government level, at the private sector, corporate level, and at the popular level. And the challenges are discussed in the report. You can see them listed here on the slide. I'm not going to belabor the point very much. You can read a little bit more about it, but what I do want to say today is that our policy recommendations in the report offer ways to deal with these challenges that I think are very promising and very new. And so let me just spell out a few of them for you before I close with a few pictures. One is regional cooperation. This is an area where the normalization between Israel and some new Arab countries in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with Saudi Arabia and others behind the scenes, further afield in Northern Africa, Sudan and Morocco, and of course with Israel's long-standing neighboring peace partners, Jordan and Egypt. Relations between open business and technology relations between Israel and all of those countries offer Israel and the United States opportunities for new trilateral partnerships to spread the benefits of technology in so many different areas, whether it's regarding climate change, regarding water and food security, regarding cybersecurity, regarding economic prosperity based on the new technologies that Israel and the United States are developing together. And some of these opportunities are already being taken advantage of. There are already companies in Morocco, in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, and in the United States that are working with Israeli companies in joint projects to develop Israeli technologies for the benefit of all of those societies, and in fact, for the global economic and environmental health into the future. A second way in which the United States and Israel can and should take advantage of new opportunities for partnership is in making sure that the Palestinians are included in these new areas of technological cooperation among Israel, the United States, and Arab partners. And unofficially, perhaps, because the political constraints are admittedly severe, at least for the time being, unofficially, we have good indications that the youth segment, especially of the Palestinians, are taking advantage of opportunities to work with Israeli high-tech companies to partner in new trilateral ventures with Israeli, American, and Arab companies in order to benefit from Israel's technological cutting-edge achievements and to transfer some of that into their own society. And the third and final policy recommendation has to do with the American bureaucracy and the Israeli bureaucracy. Needless to say, both bureaucracies are not always in the best position to navigate some of the challenges that they both face, whether it's the issue of competition with China or questions of just economic distribution of benefits. And what we recommend, and I'm not going to bore you with the whole series of bureaucratic acronyms right now, but you can see them spelled out in the report. What we recommend is that both the Israeli and the American bureaucracies in the government and in the private sector work together more efficiently in order to deal cooperatively with some of these urgent challenges. And I would say that one very encouraging sign that this is starting to happen is the announcement just this week by the American National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and his Israeli counterpart, that the two countries are setting up a coordinating committee to work together on overcoming bureaucratic and any other obstacles to cooperation against Iranian threats in the region as a whole. And this, as I said, will benefit the United States, Israel, and the newfound Arab partners that both countries today enjoy. So as a final parting shot, can we have the next 3 slides, Corey? I just want to show you some visual evidence of some of the things I just talked about that point to this new generation of American, Israeli, and global technological cooperation. Talk about water security. This is a machine invented in Israel and exported, in some cases, free of charge to developing countries in Africa and elsewhere all over the world that literally makes water out of thin air, that literally takes the hydrogen and the oxygen out of the air and in an economic, scalable way turns it into drinking water and water that can be used for agricultural or industrial uses. And this is something that Israel, in partnership with American engineers and developers, is sharing with the world today. Next slide, please. Another rather remarkable Israeli invention that combines artificial intelligence and high-tech agriculture to the benefit of the entire world's food supply. I'm not exaggerating. Many of you have probably heard of the really serious phenomenon and danger of beehive colony collapse. It is decimating, literally, the population of bees that pollinate the entire world's food supply, no exaggeration, here in the United States and all over the world. And Israel just invented a solution for this problem that has eluded every other attempt so far, that is based on artificial intelligence. And what it does is it remotely monitors conditions and threats inside each individual beehive and responds automatically by adjusting the temperature, the humidity, the water supply, the air filtration system, the nutrients, and everything else that beekeepers or farmers on an industrial scale need to provide to their beehives, even if they're hundreds or even thousands of miles away, in order to make sure that their crops can continue to grow. This is a new system that Israel developed and is now in partnership with American companies producing and distributing all over the world. And finally, back on the hard security, next slide, please, final one. Back on the hard security side that we started with today, this is a visual representation of the technological miracle that Mike Eisenstadt described in his opening remarks, which is used by the United States and many other American allies, invented by Israel and produced and distributed in partnership with an American and an Israeli company, that enables pilots to use very easily and freely and quickly artificial intelligence and other remote systems, and to operate their aircraft and confront enemies or other adverse conditions with the greatest of ease, as they say, that any technology and any human capabilities can enable today. So that's my final visual example of growing American-Israeli partnerships. And I yield the floor back to you, the audience, for your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David. Absolutely fascinating. Water from thin air.
Water from thin air, literally. Right. That's right.
You like saying literally. Yeah, it's literally water from thin air. All right. So yeah. We have, I want to thank, first of all of our panelists. Absolutely fascinating presentations. We have a bunch of questions that have already come in. And some of them are around, let's say, this issue, which is traditionally, and for obvious and logical reasons, a lot of the ingenuity in the U.S., a lot of the innovation in the U.S. Israel relationship has focused on innovations in security and hard security issues. Now, you've touched on some of the other realms. What do we need to do, or does anything need to be done to affect the thinking of leaders on both sides, Washington and Jerusalem, to sort of open up the potential for the non-security stream of innovation? Or is it taking off on its own and leaders don't really need to get much more involved? I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'll jump in here with my preliminary quick reaction to that. It's a really good question. I do think that there is more awareness of the soft security, that is public health, environmental, cyber, and other aspects of this high-tech partnership between the US and Israel. There's more awareness of that than ever before in both countries. And that awareness has been, I would say, most notable in the private sector rather than in the governments on either side. American companies, the giants of American industry in every field, not just IT, but agriculture and medicine and food and other industries and services, are cooperating with Israel at a really remarkable pace every single year. And that's despite any bureaucratic or political obstacles that they may have felt they faced. It's the governments that are perhaps a little bit behind the curve on these soft security issues, and particularly when it comes to multilateral cooperation. That's where I think the governments, both in Washington and in Jerusalem, could usefully step up, because there's great opportunity today for Israel and the United States to share these partnerships, especially in soft security, where the defense issues are not as much of a concern, to share these environmental and public health and other partnerships with other countries through international institutions, whether it's the WHO or the UN, other UN agencies, or some of the existing Middle East specialized agencies that are even based in Arab countries, like the Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi or the Desalination Center in Oman, and cooperate with AID and the Israeli counterpart, Mashav, the Israeli multilateral cooperation and technical assistance agency, to do that on a global scale. And I do think that the Biden administration in particular, because of its focus on multilateralism and on global challenges like climate and energy and so on, is especially well placed if they, get more in tune with this, to bring Israel into closer partnership with the United States and with other countries, including Arab countries and the Palestinians, on all of these issues.
So, Robert, if I could chime in on that briefly.
Please.
The reason I think that you had security driving the cooperation in the past was very simple. It was threat. It was an existential threat to Israelis if the Iranians, for example, achieved nuclear capability, and we saw what happened with the terrorist attacks and everything else. But in my remarks, what I alluded to is that line's getting blurred a lot now because a lot of innovation in the United States even is not coming from the defense contractors, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon. It's coming from gaming industries. It's coming from the commercial sector. I mean, what's exploded, I know Samantha can say, what's exploded AI in recent years is not the neural networks that have been around for many years. It's the processing power that's been achieved coming out of the gaming industry and other commercial applications. And so I think those lines are being blurred between cooperation for security and cooperation in other areas. And I actually see cooperation in other areas begin to drive advantages in the security arena.
Yeah, and I agree, and there are things. I mean, even last month, the Department of Energy and Israel's Ministry of Energy and the Israeli Innovation Authority announced the winners in a grant under the U.S. Israel Energy Center, specifically focused on cybersecurity for the energy sector, right? So. And it included some of the great stuff that's being done out in Arizona. So there was a state component to all of this as well.
Interesting. All right.
The only thing I would just add to this, Rob, if you don't mind.
Yes, please, Mike.
There's a series of binational research and development organizations that have been sponsoring research for years. They're kind of quasi, governmental. And this is a way for the government to perhaps direct research in areas, kind of niche areas where there are gaps or needs that maybe the private sector is not incentivized to answer. So there are ways that government around the edges can perhaps incentivize research. But by and large, I agree with all the other speakers. The private sector will find its own way, and they're pretty good at that. All
right. A number of questions have come in about China. China came up in a couple of presentations. Perceptions of the China threat and how our two governments and our two sets of private industries and our two national security establishments view this, reacting to it and are reacting to each other about it. So let's just take a minute to delve into this if we can. And I think perhaps one of the most useful ways to address it would be what more can be done to make sure that our two governments, institutions, private sectors are on the same page on viewing the challenge of China and aligning our investments in everything that we want to share with each other and cooperate on, and aligning them properly. Comments?
No, let me offer an observation. I remember back in the early 90s, right after the wall had fallen, and we were talking about Russia as an ally. U.S. industry was encouraged, as China was opening up, to do business in China, and was willing to actually give a lot of concessions to the Chinese in doing that. And so my point is, it took quite a while for the United States and through several administrations to realize that that may be not the best thing we should be doing based on what now has occurred. And I think the Chinese viewed what happened in the first Gulf War, and they were shocked by the differential between U.S. military capability and what they saw with the Iraqis. And they started, I think, at that point, a full spectrum conflict with us, whether from financial to cyber to military confrontation to space. A lot of their programs are specifically designed to target U.S. capabilities, without a doubt. So my point is, it took us a while to realize that they don't have our best interest at heart. And I think you're seeing the same thing maybe with Israelis. And I think now you're beginning to see with their outreach to Iran, maybe they don't have the best interest of the Israelis at heart either.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's right. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly why some of the Israelis I talk to don't seem to get it or care as much. Look, we have different experiences as countries. They are a very small country. They look at, their own very small security landscape. Then they look at the broader region about how it's going to flow back, to their very small country. We, the United States, look at the globe and look at our role in kind of protecting the entire globe and, where threats are arising. So when we see China building, fake islands in the South China Sea or encroaching upon our good friend and ally Japan, or threatening Taiwan, or expanding other parts in Asia and now beyond, when we look at what they're doing in Latin America or in Africa and their predatory practices, we take it personally, right? Whereas the Israelis, I think to this point, kind of haven't really taken it personally because it's far out there and it might not concern them. But the other big factor is the sustained attacks upon our infrastructure, upon our intellectual property, the theft of personal and private data over and over by the Chinese. I mean, obviously, everyone points to the OPM hack. You, General, lost a lot of your private information from your security clearances when the Chinese hacked the Office of Personnel and Management and hoovered up a whole bunch of our data. Back even then, we were figuring out how they were going to try to use it against us, which they are beginning to. Israel hasn't had some of those experiences. So people said, well, let's do more threat sharing with the Israelis. We have. And I think some are coming along and others are still like, well, you're threat sharing, but those are threats to you, not to us. I think it's going to get there as we do more of what we just said, which is the U.S. and Israel cooperating and having more joint ventures in the technology that is powering all of our security and defense. The Chinese and other adversarial actors are going to try to breach those firewalls, steal that data, steal the IP, undermine those innovations. And then we're going to see Israel having more skin in the game because it's going to be direct attacks upon things that they are doing. They will now feel our pain, so to speak. We will get to a point. I just would hope the Israelis can get there before we have to have those breaches to such a large extent.
Okay, thank you.
Just a matter of being persistent and being persistent, sending people over there, education. And keep in mind, there was this recent scandal. There's a recent scandal in Israel with regard to former Ministry of Defense people who were in a home workshop making a homemade missile using very sensitive proprietary technologies to sell presumably to China. So this will have, I think this will have an effect, although I think the defense ministry people are among the most cognizant of the problem. I think it may be elsewhere in the system.
Sure. I mean, things like that you just said harken back to, some problems that we had years and years ago, and good friend, ally or not, any country that, is going to sell an adversary something that's going to hurt the United States, not going to be a great friend and ally going forward. I can tell you that. But And so they have to get that message loud and clear from all quarters, from their friends, particularly from their friends. But, you know, I mean, sharing threat intelligence, look, that's how we broke through on Huawei, the threats from Huawei with the Brits, one of our greatest allies, right? I mean, they were going down a different path. And, you know, we had to go back and continually share information, share what Huawei was doing, why it is such a great risk to the British going forward. And, you know, they said, oh, wait, right. we agree with you. And we see this in our own interest to, you know, to hold the line against Chinese technological encroachment.
So I received a number of questions coming to you, General, on the question of how do we expand missile defense that the United States and Israel are working on so intently. How do we expand it to other countries in the Middle East who share similar threats? What's the next step in this? Do you see the potential of regional missile defense cooperation? Should it be just a series of bilateral areas of cooperation, obviously focusing on the Persian Gulf? And so I'd turn first to you and any of the other panelists who want to comment on this.
Sure, Robert. So first of all, I think we can do a little bit of one step at a time. And I'll give you an example. In missile defense, you can never have enough sensors and enough eyes. The more you know about the threat missiles, about their positioning, about their threat suites, et cetera, the better off you are in being able to successfully defeat them. And so I believe sensors and radars that can be deployed in countries that are closer to the threat to give early warning for all the countries and targeting information would be a first step forward. And building the hooks into the architecture, into the command and control architectures to allow that kind of cooperation is exactly what I would be targeting. And that would be the first step in terms of an architecture, to build that sensor network that would really enhance the overall effectiveness of the missile defense system of each nation, and then be able to going downstream even more fully integrate into things like shot doctrine and that type of thing between the various countries. So I think you could do a little bit of crawl, walk, and run as you do that.
All right, very good. Any other comments on this? Okay. Well, we've reached 10 past 3, which is just at our witching hour. So I'm going to say thank you to our 4 panelists. We have touched on, I think, just the surface of a really remarkable agenda. If you want to look out to the future of potential U.S. Israel partnership and cooperation. And so I want to thank all of you for helping to focus our attention on this. And maybe, just maybe, with all the different tugs on this administration, all the different challenges we face, we'll find enough time and enough wherewithal to take advantage of the potential cooperation in service of both of our countries. So I want to thank all of the panelists and thank all of our viewers for watching this policy forum today. Thank you.